The greatest swordsman in the Imperium started as a loyal son. 1,000 years of holy war transformed him into something else entirely. When Sigismund finally faced Abdon the Despoiler, he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to show the galaxy what defiance truly means. I was there when they brought him into being. I was there when he died. In the endless march of millennia, my mechanical eyes have watched empires crumble and stars die. Yet of all the souls I have chronicled, none burned with such terrible purpose as Sigismund. This is not a tale of glory, though glory there was. This is not a tale of honor, though honor was its beginning. This is the accounting of faith transformed into obsession, of duty calcified into destiny. I am Chronicler Unit 379112, and before my mind was bound to this ship, I walked as a man. What remains of my organic components has served aboard the Eternal Crusader for over 4,000 years. My function is to remember, to record, to witness, and I witnessed him. The first time I saw Sigismund, he stood in the shadow of Rogel Dawn himself. I was still flesh then, a remembrancer assigned to document the Great Crusade. The 7 Legion gleamed in their armor of burnished gold, but even then Sigismund stood apart. Not in stature or in voice, but in stillness. Where others moved, he remained perfectly poised, as if the universe rotated around him rather than he through it. His armor bore fewer honors than many of his brothers, yet none questioned his place at the right hand of the Primarch. I remember the cold precision in his eyes, not cruel, but utterly devoid of hesitation. They called him the finest blade in the Imperium. Even then, a clinical assessment that failed to capture the terrible beauty of his violence. I once witnessed him in the training cages beneath the phalanx. 3 hours he fought without pause against servitors and brothers alike. No wasted movement, no flair or performance, just the mathematical certainty of death dealt with such economy it approached art. When the last opponent fell, Sigismund simply turned and walked away. His breathing as measured as if he had been standing in contemplation rather than dealing death. The blades he wielded then were standard-issue combat swords. Yet in his hands they became extensions of his will, instruments of a martial philosophy so pure it transcended mere combat doctrine. Other warriors of the 7 Legion were renowned for their defensive tactics, for the impenetrable shield wall that was their hallmark. But Sigismund understood that the perfect defense was not an unbreakable shield, but a blade that struck with such precision that no enemy could complete their attack. I recall how the other captains would gather to watch him train. Alexis Pak, massive and stoic, Halra, analytical and measured, Catapult with his perpetual scowl. They observed with the critical eyes of master warriors, seeking to identify the secret of his skill, to distill it into something that could be taught to others. But there was something ineffable about Sigismund's mastery, something that defied analysis or replication. It was not merely physical prowess or tactical acumen, but a perfect unity of body and purpose that transcended both. The remembrances among my colleagues attempted to capture his essence in verse and painting. They failed. How could pigment on canvas convey the lethal grace of his movements? How could words encapsulate the absolute certainty with which he wielded death? I chose instead to simply record, to document with dispassionate precision the facts of his victories, the tallies of his kills, the honors bestowed upon him by his Primarch and his Emperor. But even these clinical accountings took on a mythic quality when compiled, as if the sheer weight of his accomplishments transformed mundane records into legend. What separates a warrior from a weapon? Perhaps nothing but time and purpose. Sigismund began as one and ended as the other. I record this now in the quiet hollow spaces between battles as the Eternal Crusader cuts through the void toward yet another war in a crusade without end. The ship bears the echo of his presence still in the battle chapels. Initiates whisper his name like a prayer. Though few understand the man behind the myth they venerate. They know the Emperor's champion, the first High Marshal, founder of their order. They do not know the cold fire that consumed him from within. They do not know how faith can become a more terrible prison than doubt. I sometimes access the memory cores where I store the earliest recordings of Sigismund, comparing the warrior he was with the legend he became. There is a moment captured during a campaign against Zeno's marauders on the fringes of what would later be designated the Ultima Segmentum. Sigismund, then serving as a line captain, leads a strike force against the alien command node. The fighting is intense. the Zenus utilizing a technology that warps reality itself to confound the Imperial forces. I observe him pausing in the midst of battle, assessing the shifting terrain with a tactician's eye, then adjusting his strategy with immediate effect. There is flexibility there, adaptation, a willingness to discard plans that no longer serve their purpose. A quality that would gradually calcify as faith replaced reason as the cornerstone of his being. The Imperial Palace on Terror gleamed like a false heaven during those last days of peace. Mankind stood at the apex of its greatness, unaware of how swiftly such heights invite downfall. The Emperor had returned to Terror, and with him came the Taurian, Rogel Dawn, to fortify the throne world against threats none yet perceived but the master of mankind himself. With Dawn came his sons, the Imperial Fists, and chief among them was Sigismund. I remember him standing on the walls, looking outward, not in vigilance, but in anticipation, as if some part of him already knew that fire would soon test the stone and steel raised by his legion. The Seven Legion was dispersed across the Sol system, strengthening its defenses. According to the Taurians' master plan, Sigismund oversaw the fortification of the palace itself. His natural affinity for offensive action temporarily channeled into the creation of killing grounds and fire lanes of choke points where future attackers would be funneled and destroyed. He drove the Imperial army units assigned to him with merciless efficiency, demanding standards that mortal men could scarcely meet. Yet they tried, pushed beyond their limits by the force of his expectations, becoming harder, sharper, more lethal under his command. It was during this time that I noted the first subtle shifts in his demeanor. The coldly efficient warrior began to display a philosophical bent previously absent from his character. He would spend hours in the palace libraries, studying ancient texts on warfare, not for their tactical insights, but for their understanding of the warrior spirit. He began to speak of duty not merely as obligation to his legion and his emperor, but as a transcendent purpose that gave meaning to existence itself. Small changes easily overlooked amid the frenetic activity of fortification, but significant in retrospect. The first hairline fractures in the foundation of reason upon which his martial excellence had been built. Then came the warrior woman, the one they called the saint. WH40K, former remembrancer turned prophet of a faith that had no name yet. She moved through the palace like a flame, speaking of the emperor not as a leader of men, but as a divine being, an embodiment of mankind's spiritual potential. Most of the Imperial Fists dismissed her as a curiosity at best, a distraction at worst. But I saw Sigismund lingering at the edges of gatherings where she spoke. His expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. Something in her words resonated with a question he had, not yet consciously formed, a void within him that tactical doctrine and martial prowess could not fill. The news of Horus' betrayal struck the palace like a physical blow. I was present when Rogel Dawn received the message from the War Master that would reveal his treachery. The Primarch, always stoic, became statue still, the data slate in his massive hand seeming to shrink as his grip tightened. But it was Sigismund I watched that day. While shock and denial rippled through those present, his expression hardened into something like recognition, not surprise, not horror, but the grim satisfaction of a man who was prepared for a storm and now sees the first clouds on the horizon. In the immediate aftermath, while the Primarch sequestered himself to process the enormity of his brother's betrayal, Sigismund gathered those captains of the Imperial Fists who were present on Terror. In a strategium overlooking the palace grounds, he addressed them with a clarity and conviction that belied the chaos unfolding across the Imperium. I recorded his words as was my function, capturing the moment when tactical assessment began to blend with something approaching religious fervor. The War Arm Master's treachery is not a failure of strategy. He told them, his voice level, but charged with an intensity that commanded absolute attention. It is a failure of purpose. Horus lost sight of why we fight, of what the Great Crusade truly means. He saw only the conquest, not the reason behind it. The Emperor does not send us to bring worlds to compliance for the sake of empire alone, but because humanity must be united to survive what is to come. The War Master forgot this truth, and in forgetting he has damned himself and those who follow him. The captains listened in silence, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably at the implications of his words. Sigismund had not directly contradicted the imperial truth, the secular doctrine that underpinned the Great Crusade. But there was something in his framing that hinted at a deeper, more mystical understanding of their mission. A A sense that the emperor's work was not merely practical, but providential, a subtle shift, but one that would widen into a chasm as events unfolded. Later, within the chambers of the Templar Brethren, those first warriors who would form the core of what would become the Black Templars, Sigismund spoke words that would echo through millennia. I stood in the shadows, recording, as was my duty, as he addressed his chosen brothers. His voice carried the weight of prophecy, though at the time I mistook it for mere resolve. The War Master has revealed the true nature of man, he said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. We stand at the precipice of the age that will define humanity. Not an age of reason or enlightenment, not an age of progress or peace, but an age of faith and fire, of blood and devotion. The Emperor is not just our leader. He is not merely our creator. He is the one true God of mankind. And we are his sword. Some shifted uncomfortably at such words. The imperial truth still held sway. The doctrine that there were no gods, no supernatural forces worthy of worship. Yet Sigismund spoke heresy with the conviction of a prophet. And in times of extremity, it is not reason that prevails, but the voice that speaks with absolute certainty. None challenged him. None reported his words to the Primarch. Instead, they listened, and the seed of what would become a crusading faith took root in their hearts. I recall one warrior, Bohemond, who would later become a marshal of the Black Templars, asking a question that cut to the heart of the matter. If the Emperor is divine, why has he not claimed this mantle himself? Why does he insist there are no gods when his own power approaches the godly? Sigismund's answer revealed the depth of his emerging theological framework. Because a true God does not need to proclaim his divinity, it simply is. The Emperor denies his godhood not because it is false, but because faith must be freely given to have power. He tests us brothers. He watches to see who will recognize the truth without being told. Who will give their devotion not because it is commanded but because it is right. This reasoning, circular though it was, satisfied those present. It allowed them to reconcile their loyalty to the Emperor with their growing spiritual needs in the face of galactic calamity. And it positioned Sigismund not merely as their combat leader, but as a spiritual guide who could interpret the Emperor's will, even when it seemed to contradict his stated doctrine. I watched as Sigismund changed in those early days of the heresy. The disciplined clinical warrior began to adopt rituals. Before battle, he would fast for 24 hours, then spend another day in prayer and meditation. He inscribed devotional texts upon parchment, then burned them to ash, which he mixed with sacred oils to anoint his weapons. He took a vow to never remove his armor until the traitors were defeated. A vow he would maintain for centuries long after the Siege of Terror ended and the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. These practices spread among the Templar Brethren, each warrior adapting them to their own temperament but maintaining the core of devotional fervor that Sigismund had introduced. They began to modify their armor, painting portions of it black to symbolize their special status within the Legion, adding devotional scripts and purity seals, where once they had displayed only campaign badges and kill markings. Their training took on aspects of religious ritual, each practiced duel preceded by prayers, each victory or defeat interpreted as a sign of the Emperor's favor or a test of their worthiness. Rogel Dawn observed these changes with the inscrutability that was his hallmark. The Primarch himself remained committed to the imperial truth, to the secular foundations of the Imperium that his father had built. But he was also a pragmatist, recognizing that in the coming conflict he would need warriors of absolute commitment, whose resolve would not waver regardless of the horrors they faced. If faith provided that resolve, perhaps it was a useful fiction, a motivating myth that would serve its purpose in the crucible of war. The title Emperor's Champion was not bestowed upon him. He claimed it, forging his identity in the crucible of his own convictions. He commissioned artificers to craft a suit of armor of unparalleled artistry. Midnight black where the imperial fists wore gold, adorned with scriptures and oaths of moment that wrapped around van braces and greaves like chains binding him to his purpose. When he donned that armor for the first time, something in Sigismund died. The man who had known doubt, who had understood fear, who had comprehended the concept of restraint, was sealed away behind a facade of absolute certainty. The artificers worked day and night to complete the armor according to Sigismund's exacting specifications. Master Guillem, chief of the Legion's forge, personally oversaw the creation of the suit, incorporating relics recovered from battlefields across the Great Crusade. The breastplate contained fragments of metal taken from the Emperor's own war gear, melted down and reforged with prayers etched into each molecule by Kyrojan servitors with microscopic precision tools. The helmet was designed to evoke the stern visage of imperial justice, its faceplate an expressionless mask that concealed the man within completely. When the armor was complete, Sigismund performed a ritual of his own devising before donning it. He knelt in meditation for a full day, neither eating nor drinking, reciting the names of every battle he had fought in service to the Emperor. Then he drew blood from his own veins and used it to anoint each component of the armor, binding his life force to the war gear in a symbolic union of flesh and fars, ceramite. Only then did he allow the artifices to seal him within the suit. Each connection made with reverential care, each power conduit blessed as it was linked to his black carapace. I cannot say whether it was madness or transcendence. The line between zealot and saint often exists only in the judgment of history, but I can attest that when Sigismund emerged in his black armor, even his brothers regarded him with a mixture of awe and unease. All save for Rogel Dawn, who recognized in his first captain a weapon honed to its ultimate purpose. The Primarch may not have shared Sigismund's growing religious fervor, but he understood its utility. Faith, after all, is simply another kind of fortification. It shores up resolve where reason might falter. The transformation was not merely external. Sigismund's combat doctrine evolved alongside his spiritual awakening. Where once he had fought with calculated precision, now he moved with an almost preternatural intuition. His strikes were no longer merely efficient, but revelatory. Each blow a sermon delivered in the language of violence. He spoke of combat as communion, of the killing stroke as absolution, of blood spilled as sacrament. The Templar Brethren adopted his philosophies, creating a martial culture intertwined with religious devotion that would eventually form the foundation of the Black Templars chapter. It was during this period that Sigismund began to gather specific warriors to his side, men whose temperaments resonated with his own evolving beliefs. Bohemund, whose question had revealed a mind already receptive to the concept of the Emperor's divinity. Corden, whose stoic exterior concealed a soul in search of transcendent purpose. Heraclius, whose berserker fury found focus and direction in the ritual Sigismund prescribed. These and others would form the core of what would later become the leadership of the Black Templars. Each chosen not just for their martial skill, but for their spiritual potential. The day the traitor fleets appeared in the skies above Terror, I stood with the command staff in the Stratego's chamber of the palace. Tactical holoth displays bathed the room in a ghostly blue glow, showing the overwhelming forces that had come to burn the throne world. Solar defense platforms were already falling silent, their signals winking out one by one as the traitor forces overwhelmed them. The Primarchs present. Sanguinius with his wings folded behind him like a shroud. Jagati Kun vibrating with contained energy and Rogel Dawn immovable as the walls he had built studied the displays with the calm of demigods. It was Sigismund who spoke first, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed misplaced in the face of such odds. "They will break upon the walls of our faith," he said. And in that moment I saw something pass between him and the Primarchs. Not agreement precisely, but recognition. In the darkness that was to come, cold reason would not be enough. They would need fire to match fire. They would need warriors who did not calculate odds but transcended them. Rogel Dawn turned to his first captain, his expression as unreadable as ever, but there was a weight to his gaze that spoke volumes. "Then you will be the first test they face," the Primarch said, his voice like stone grinding against stone. "Choose your warriors. Take position at the Eternity Gate. Let no traitor pass while you draw breath." Sigismund bowed, a gesture both martial and devotional. "By your command, my lord, by his will." The slight emphasis on the second sentence did not escape the Primarch's notice, but he made no comment. Instead, he turned back to the holoth displays, already focusing on the next strategic decision, the next deployment of forces. Sigismund departed, gathering his Templar brethren for what would become one of the most storied stands in the history of the Imperium. The Siege of Terror has been chronicled by minds more learned than mine in histories that span entire library worlds. I was but one observer of that apocalypse, and my memories of those days blur together in a haze of fire and blood, and the constant grinding roar that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the palace. But Sigismund stands out in those memories with terrible clarity. He was everywhere during the siege. A black whirlwind moving from one desperate battle to another. Always to the most critical points, always where death pressed closest. I remember him at the Eternity Wall spaceport where the traitor forces had gained a foothold. The defenders were being pushed back meter by bloody meter, the bodies of the dead forming barricades over which the living fought. Sigismund arrived with a contingent of his Templar brethren, each clad in armor painted black like his own, each bearing the symbols of their newfound faith. They did not rush to the front lines. Instead, Sigismund led them to a chapel within the spaceport, a small shrine that had somehow remained intact amid the devastation. There, as death rained down around them, they knelt in prayer. Some of the mortal soldiers looked on in disbelief, in anger, even believing these transhuman warriors were abdicating their duty in the hour of greatest need. But when they emerged, the Black Templars moved with a synchronicity that transcended battlefield coordination. It was as if they fought with one mind, one purpose, their movements guided by something beyond tactical doctrine. At their head, Sigismund wielded his blade with such speed it seemed to disappear. Only the trail of blood in the air marking its passage. The chapel where they had prayed was destroyed minutes after they left it. A direct hit from a traitor bombardment reducing it to rubble. But by then, Sigismund and his warriors were deep in the enemy lines, cutting a path of destruction that would become the stuff of legend. They fought without regard for their own survival, yet moved with a precision that belied their apparent disregard for tactical doctrine. It was as if they operated on a plane of understanding beyond the conventional battlefield, seeing patterns and possibilities invisible to others. I saw him duel a champion of the traitor legions. That day, a monstrous figure whose armor had been reshaped by the powers of the warp into a grotesque parody of the estate's form. The creature wielded a mole that crackled with unnatural energies, each impact leaving reality itself bruised and bleeding. It bellowed blasphemies with a mouth that stretched too wide across a face that seemed to constantly shift and flow. But Sigismund did not flinch. He did not hesitate. He moved like water around the creature's brutal swings, his sword finding gaps in armor that should not have existed, drawing blood that steamed and hissed when it touched the air. The duel lasted 17 minutes by my chronometric count, though it seemed both shorter and longer to those who witnessed it. The traitor champion was novice warrior, no mere line fighter elevated beyond his capabilities by the gifts of chaos. He was a veteran of 100 campaigns, his skill honed over decades of warfare, now enhanced by the unnatural blessings of his dark patrons. Yet against Sigismund, he appeared almost clumsy, his attacks powerful but predictable, his defenses solid but insufficient. When the traitor champion fell, Sigismund did not acknowledge the victory. There was no moment of triumph, no recognition of his skill. He simply moved to the next enemy and the next, as if each kill was merely another prayer offered to his god-emperor. By the time the spaceport was secured, his black armor was so thoroughly coated in gore that the devotional texts inscribed upon it were obscured. Only the white cross on his pauldron remained visible, a stark symbol of his faith rising above the carnage. Throughout the siege, the legend of the Black Knight grew. Imperial forces took heart when he appeared in their sector, believing his presence signified the emperor's attention and favor. The traitors learned to fear the sight of his midnight armor and the white cross emblazoned upon it. Commanders on both sides began to factor his movements into their strategies, as if he were a force of nature rather than one warrior among thousands. But to see him in those moments of quiet between battles was to understand that the man was being consumed by his own legend. I found him once in a half-ruined stratagem, kneeling before a makeshift shrine he had constructed from battlefield debris. The icon at its center was not a traditional aquila or imperial seal, but a broken piece of ceramite, unmistakably a fragment of the emperor's own armor recovered from some unknown engagement. Sigismund had arranged candles around it, their light reflecting off his armor as he knelt motionless in prayer. I am certain he knew of my presence. Yet he did not acknowledge me. For hours he remained there until a runner came with word of a new assault, and he rose without a word to meet it. What prayers did he offer in those dark hours? What promises did he make to the God he had decided to serve, even as that God denied such divinity? I cannot say. But I know that with each battle, with each kill, something of Sigismund, the man was sacrificed upon the altar of Sigismund, the symbol. He was becoming what the Imperium needed him to be, a figure of absolute faith in an age where certainty had become the most precious of commodities. The weeks of siege became months, the fighting unrelenting, the casualties mounting beyond calculation. The palace walls, masterpieces of fortification designed by Dawn himself, began to buckle under the relentless assault of traitor forces. The outer precincts fell one by one, the defenders forced to fall back to interior lines, abandoning ground that had been paid for with oceans of blood. Through it all, Sigismund and his black-armored warriors appeared wherever the fighting was fiercest, their presence often making the difference between defeat and a desperate holding action that bought precious hours for the overall defense. The toll on Sigismund himself was evident to those who served closely with him. Though his physical prowess showed no sign of diminishing, there was a consuming intensity to his actions that went beyond mere combat efficiency. He fought as if each engagement might be his last, as if only through the perfect expression of violence could he fulfill his purpose. The times between battles, once spent in tactical planning and equipment maintenance, now were given over entirely to prayer and ritual. He ate only what was necessary to sustain his enhanced physiology, slept only when his body could no longer function without rest, and spoke only to issue orders or to lead his warriors in devotional rites of his own creation. It was during this period that Sigismund began to develop the theological framework that would eventually form the core beliefs of Black Templars. In rare moments of relative calm, he would gather his closest warriors and expound upon his understanding of the Emperor's divine nature, of mankind's place in a hostile universe, of the sacred duty of the estates, to serve as instruments of the master of mankind's will. These were not formal sermons, but rather explorations of a faith being forged in the crucible of war. Each insight emerging from the blood-soaked reality of the siege. "We are not mere soldiers," he told them during one such gathering held in the flickering light of a generatorium that provided power to the defense batteries of the Sanctum Imperialis. "We are not simply weapons, though we serve as both. We are the physical manifestation of his judgment, the extension of his will into a galaxy that has forgotten the meaning of justice. Each blow we strike is not just against the enemy before us, but against the very concept of defiance against his plan for humanity. When we kill, we do not merely end a life. We render a verdict upon that life, finding it wanting in the eyes of the only judge who matters." Such rhetoric would have been deemed dangerous heresy before the heresy itself began. Now, with the Imperium teetering on the brink of annihilation, with the secular foundations of the imperial truth revealed as insufficient bulwarks against the tide of chaos, these words found fertile ground in the hearts of warriors desperate for meaning amid the slaughter. The Templar brethren did not just listen. They internalized Sigismund's teachings, each warrior becoming not just a follower, but an evangelist who spread the creed to others within the legion. The final days of the siege are seared into the memory of all who survived them. The traitor Primarch Horus lowered the void shields of his battle barge, challenging the Emperor himself to face him. The master of mankind departed for that final confrontation, taking with him Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Rogel Dawn. In their absence, the defense of the palace fell to others. Sigismund took command of a critical juncture where the walls had been breached, the traitor forces pouring through like a toxic tide. I observed from a command bunker as he organized the defense, his voice betraying no fatigue despite weeks of constant battle. He deployed his forces with a tactician's precision, yet his strategies bore the mark of his evolving philosophy. Where once he might have prioritized the preservation of forces and resources, now he spoke of martyrdom and sacrifice, of deaths that would inspire others to greater feats of valor. The defenders under his command fought with a fatalistic fury, knowing that retreat was not an option, that each meter of ground must be purchased with blood. "Hold this line." He commanded a mixed force of imperial fists and army regulars, his voice cutting through the cacophony of battle like a blade. Not for strategic advantage, not for tactical necessity, but because he expects it of you. Because in this moment, on this spot, you are the fulcrum upon which the fate of mankind turns. Each second you buy with your blood is a second in which he works his will aboard the vengeful spirit. Die if you must, but die facing the enemy. Die with his name on your lips. Die knowing that your sacrifice has meaning beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Such words should have seemed empty rhetoric in the face of the horror confronting them. The traitor forces included not just the corrupted estates of the renegade legions, but demonic entities whose very Existence defied sanity, whose forms writhed with impossible geometries, and whose voices carried madness on every syllable. Yet the defenders rallied, mortal men standing shoulder to shoulder with transhuman warriors, all drawing strength from the absolute conviction radiating from the Black Knight who led them. Then came the moment that would echo through the millennia to follow. A tremor passed through reality itself. Every soul on Terror felt it. A psychic shock wave that transcended physical sensation. In that instant, we all knew, though none could have said how, that something momentous had occurred aboard the vengeful Spirit. The traitor forces seemed to feel it too, their advance faltering as confusion spread through their ranks. Sigismund stood perfectly still amid the chaos, his head tilted as if listening to a distant voice. Then, with deliberate calm, he removed his helmet. It was the first time I had seen his face since the siege began. His features were gaunt, his skin pallid from weeks within his armor, but his eyes burned with an inner light that was almost painful to behold. He lifted his gaze to the sky toward the distant battle barge where destinies were being decided. "He is no more," Sigismund said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. None needed to ask who he meant. And yet he endures. The mortal emperor is dead. The immortal god is born. How he knew of Horus's defeat, of the emperor's mortal wounding, I cannot explain. Perhaps it was simply the intuition of a warrior who had given himself wholly to faith. Perhaps it was something more, some touch of his god's power reaching out to the most devout of his servants. What matters is that in that moment of ultimate crisis, Sigismund became the voice of a new imperial creed. The mortal emperor was gone, but faith in him would endure. Indeed, it would become the foundation upon which a new Imperium would rise. The traitors broke soon after, their forces retreating from Terror in disarray. But there was no victory celebration, no triumph. The emperor was interred upon the golden throne. His physical form shattered beyond repair, sustained only by the ancient mechanisms of that arcane device, and his own unfathomable will. Rogel Dawn emerged from that final confrontation changed. His stoic demeanor now tinged with a sorrow that seemed to reach to the very core of his being. And it was to Sigismund that he turned when the question of pursuing the retreating traitors arose. In the strategium of the imperial palace, now serving as a council chamber for the leaders of the shattered Imperium, I watched as primarchs and lords debated the course of action. Some argued for consolidation, for securing what remained of the emperor's realm before attempting to reclaim what was lost. Others counseled aggressive pursuit, striking while the traitor forces were in disarray. Rogel Dawn listened to all with the grave attention that was his hallmark, but his eyes kept returning to Sigismund, who stood silent at the edge of the gathering. Finally, the primarch spoke directly to his first captain. "What would you do, Sigismund?" The chamber fell silent. For a primarch to seek the counsel of an estates, even one as renowned as Sigismund, was unusual, but in that moment it seemed right. Sigismund had become more than a space marine. He had become the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one fought not just with bolter and blade, but with faith and fury. "The traitors must never know peace," Sigismund replied, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. "Not in this life or the next. We must pursue them to the ends of the galaxy and beyond. Not for vengeance, not for glory, but because it is our sacred duty to punish the heretic, to purge the unclean. The Great Crusade was to unite humanity. The eternal crusade will be to preserve its soul." There was a finality to his words that silenced further debate. And in Rogel Dawn's eyes, I saw a decision being reached. The Codex Estates was being implemented. The Legion system dismantled in favor of smaller chapters. The Imperial Fists would comply, as was their nature. But not all would remain under the Primarch's direct command. Some would take up a different mantle, a crusade without end. The founding of the Black Templars occurred with little ceremony. Sigismund knelt before Rogel Dawn one last time, receiving his Primarch's blessing and the ancient storied weapon known as the Sword of the High Marshals. Then he rose, no longer first captain of the Imperial Fists, but High Marshal of the Black Templars. His path was set. While others would rebuild, he would pursue. While others would fortify, he would attack. His crusade would know no respite, no safe harbor, no moment of peace. The sword he received was no ordinary weapon. Legend held that it had been forged from a fragment of the Emperor's own blade, though such claims surrounded many relics of that era, and few could be verified. What is certain is that the weapon was ancient even then, its power field generator of a pattern no longer produced in the forges of Mars. Its balance so perfect it seemed to anticipate the wielder's intent rather than merely responding to it. In Sigismund's hands, it became an extension of his will, a physical manifestation of his purpose, as much a symbol as a tool of war. I accompanied him aboard the newly christened Eternal Crusader, my role as chronicler continuing under his new chapter. It was during those first years of crusade that my flesh finally failed me, my consciousness transferred into the mechanical form I now inhabit. Perhaps it was fitting, just as Sigismund had transformed himself from man to symbol, so too was I reforged from mortal to immortal observer. We were both becoming something other than human, bound to purposes that would outlast our natural lives. The transfer process was not without risk or pain. The bulk of my organic brain was carefully excised and placed within a nutrient bath connected by a web of microfine wires to the augmented coetator core that would become my new home. For weeks I existed in a twilight state, neither fully flesh nor fully machine, as the engrams of my consciousness were painstakingly mapped and transferred. Throughout the procedure, Sigismund visited the apothecarian where the work was being done, standing in silent vigil, as if to ensure that this record of his deeds of the chapter's founding would not be lost to the vagaries of technological failure. When the process was complete, when I awoke to full awareness in my new form, it was Sigismund who first addressed me. "You have transcended the weakness of flesh," he said, his voice neither congratulatory nor sympathetic, but simply acknowledging a fact. "Now you will witness the crusade not for years or decades, but for centuries. You will record our victories and our sacrifices for generations yet unborn. Through you, the truth of our purpose will endure when all who now live are dust." In that moment, I understood that I had become more than a simple chronicler. I was now a living archive, a repository of the chapter's history and doctrine, a touchstone to which future Black Templars could connect to understand the will of their founder. It was both an honor and a burden, a form of immortality that came with the price of perpetual service. In this, too, I mirrored Sigismund, whose own existence had become wholly subsumed by his duty to the Emperor and to the crusade he had initiated. The Eternal Crusade began in the Segmentum Solar, hunting down traitor forces that had scattered after the siege. But Sigismund's vision extended far beyond mere cleanup operations. He divided his chapter into crusade fleets, each led by a marshal carrying his authority, each sworn to pursue the enemies of the Emperor without cessation. The chapter would not claim a home world. The ships would be their fortress monasteries, constantly in motion, constantly at war. No Black Templar would ever know peace. It was both their burden and their glory. The organization of these crusade fleets was a masterwork of logistics and strategic foresight. Each was designed to operate independently for years if necessary, carrying not just the fighting strength of the estates, but also the support structure needed to sustain them. Forge decks for the maintenance and production of weapons and armor. Apothecarian facilities for the care of the wounded and the implementation of gene seed. Recruitment chambers where neophytes could be tested and indoctrinated. Chapels where the chapter's growing body of religious observances could be performed, all contained within massive void ships capable of warp travel across the breadth of the Imperium and beyond. Sigismund personally oversaw the formation of the first 3 crusade fleets, selecting their marshals with care, assigning to each a mix of veterans who had fought at the siege and newer recruits who had been inducted into the chapter after its founding. The balance was crucial. The veterans carried the living memory of what they fought against, of the horrors they had witnessed when chaos was unleashed upon terror. The newer warriors brought fresh zeal untainted by the fatigue of that apocalyptic conflict. Together, they formed the nucleus of a fighting force unlike any other in the fractured Imperium, one driven not by strategic necessity or political allegiance, but by religious fervor and implacable purpose. The character of the chapter was forged in those early campaigns. Where the Imperial fists were stoic, the Black Templars were zealous. Where the parent legion valued discipline, the successor chapter prized devotion. Initiates were not merely trained but indoctrinated, taught to see their service not as duty but as divine calling. The rituals Sigismund had adopted during the siege became chapter traditions. Battle prayers, fasting, the taking of oaths, the anointing of weapons, all cementing a warrior culture built around faith as much as martial prowess. The training regimen Sigismund instituted was brutally effective, designed to produce warriors who were not just physically formidable, but spiritually indomitable. Neophytes spent months in isolation, studying the chapter's creed and the theological treatises Sigismund had composed. They were subjected to simulated combat scenarios of escalating difficulty, not merely to test their martial skills, but to assess their faith under pressure. Those who faltered, who showed doubt or hesitation, were assigned to menial roles or support functions within the Crusade fleets. Only those who demonstrated both physical prowess and unwavering belief were elevated to the rank of initiate and allowed to don the black armor of a full battle brother. This selective process ensured that the Black Templars, while never numerous by the standards of the larger chapters, possessed a unity of purpose that made them devastating on the battlefield. They fought not as individuals seeking personal glory, nor as tactical units executing a strategic plan, but as a single organism animated by a shared faith that transcended individual identity. In this, they reflected their founder, whose own identity had become inseparable from his role as the Emperor's champion, as the first High Marshal of the Eternal Crusade. Sigismund himself led the most dangerous missions, always at the forefront of the crusade, always seeking the most lethal foes. His legend grew with each victory, spreading throughout the Imperium that was slowly rebuilding itself after the devastation of the heresy. To some, he was a hero. To others, a necessary evil. But to his brothers in the Black Templars, he was living proof of their creed. Devotion to the Emperor could transform a mere warrior into something transcendent. Faith could overcome any obstacle, defeat any foe. I recorded the aftermath of one particularly brutal campaign against a coalition of Zenus raiders who had taken advantage of the Imperium's weakness to establish a foothold in what had once been firmly held human space. The fighting had been savage. The Black Templars forced to adapt their tactics to counter the alien technology that seemed specifically designed to negate the advantages of art's physiology and equipment. Many brothers fell. Their gene seed recovered at great cost from battlefields saturated with xenos toxins that corroded ceramite and flesh alike. In the aftermath, as the chapter performed the rites for their fallen, Sigismund addressed the survivors in the great chapel of the Eternal Crusader. His armor bore the marks of the recent conflict. Deep gouges and acid burns that the artificers would labor for weeks to repair. But he made no move to remove it, standing before his warriors as a living embodiment of their struggle. His wounds a testament to the cost of their crusade. "Do not mourn them," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber without the need for vox amplification. "Envy them. Our brothers have achieved what we all seek. What is the ultimate purpose of our existence? Perfect unity with his will. They have transcended the limitations of physical form of individual consciousness to become one with the eternal spirit of the Emperor. We who remain behind continue to fight not because we fear death, but because our duty is not yet complete. One day, when the galaxy has been cleansed of every heretic, every Xenos, every trace of chaos, we too will join our brothers in that perfect communion. Until then, we fight. We suffer. We endure, not for victory. For victory implies an end to struggle. We fight for the fight itself, for the purifying nature of combat, for the clarity that comes only in the moment when blade meets flesh and faith meets doubt." Such rhetoric would have seemed hollow from another leader, especially after a campaign with such heavy losses for relatively modest strategic gains. But from Sigismund, it carried the weight of absolute conviction. The Black Templars did not just accept his words. They embraced them, finding in his theology a framework that gave meaning to their sacrifices, purpose to their pain. This was the true genius of Sigismund as a leader. He did not merely command obedience or inspire loyalty. He provided a cosmic context for the Sigismund, brutal realities of their existence, transforming what might have been mere grim necessity into holy purpose. Yet I who observed him in the quiet moments between battles saw the toll this transformation took. Sigismund rarely removed his armor, now even aboard ship. He took his rest in a Spartan cell adorned only with devotional texts and weapons mantled like relics. His meals, when he took them at all, were simple fare consumed without pleasure or attention. All worldly concerns fell away from him, leaving only the singular purpose that drove him forward. He was becoming less a man and more a function. The Emperor's justice given form. There were times when he would come to the archive chamber where my mechanical form was housed, where the records of the chapter's campaigns were stored in data crystals and bound to. He would stand in silence, reviewing the accounts of battles long past, of brothers long dead, of victories and defeats that had shaped the Black Templars into what they had become. In these moments, I caught glimpses of what might have been reflection, perhaps even doubt, crossing his features, but they never lasted. Whatever private struggles occurred within the mind of Sigismund, they were resolved in favor of continued devotion, of unceasing crusade. On rare occasions he would speak to me directly, not as High Marshal to Chapter Chronicler, but as one who had witnessed the birth of this new age to another. "Do you remember how it was before?" he asked once, his voice so soft it might have been mistaken for a malfunction in my audio receptors. "When we thought the greatest victory would be the unification of mankind under one banner. When we believed that reason alone would be enough to sustain us against the darkness. We were children then, playing at war while ignorant of what truly lurked beyond the light of our campfires." I did not respond, my function being to record rather than to engage. But Sigismund continued as if I had. "The Emperor knew. He always knew what waited in the void. Why else build warriors such as us, if not to face horrors beyond mortal comprehension? Why create the Primarchs if not to lead a war that would span millennia? The Great Crusade was merely preparation, a gathering of forces for the true conflict that would follow. And now we fight that war, not knowing if victory is possible, knowing only that surrender is unthinkable." Such moments of philosophical reflection became rarer as the centuries passed. As if whatever remained of the man Sigismund had once been was gradually subsumed by the role he had created for himself, the High Marshal became ever more remote, communicating with his marshals primarily through formal directives and theological proclamations, seldom engaging in the strategic debates or personal connections that characterized leadership in other chapters. Yet his authority never diminished. If anything, the aura of mystery that surrounded him only enhanced his stature among the Black Templars, transforming him from a leader into an icon, a living embodiment of the chapter's purpose and creed. The centuries passed, and still the crusade continued. Other chapters established traditions, built fortress monasteries, developed cultures distinctive from their legion origins. The Black Templars remained ever in motion, their only constant the war they waged. Their ranks swelled beyond the 1,000 warriors prescribed by the Codex. For who could count a chapter that was scattered across the stars in a 100 different crusades? Who would dare to censure the Emperor's champion for his zealous prosecution of mankind's enemies? As the Imperium settled into the form it would hold for millennia to come, as the High Lords of Terror consolidated their authority and the ecclesiarchy rose to prominence, the Black Templars found themselves in an unusual position. Their fervent faith, once considered borderline heretical when measured against the imperial truth, now aligned perfectly with the dominant ideology of the Imperium. The Emperor was officially recognized as divine, his worship becoming the state religion that bound together thousands of worlds under the imperial banner. What had been Sigismund's radical interpretation was now orthodox doctrine. Yet the Black Templars did not seek political advantage from this alignment, did not attempt to leverage their spiritual authority for material gain or strategic influence. They remained focused solely on their crusade, on the eternal war against the enemies of mankind. If anything, Sigismund became more withdrawn from the broader imperial power structure, delegating diplomatic interactions to his marshals, while he continued to lead from the front lines, seeking out the most dangerous foes, the most corrupted worlds, the most dire threats to the Emperor's realm. Sigismund aged, as all space marines do, though at a glacial pace compared to mortal men. His face became more lined. His short-cropped hair and beard turned from gold to silver, but his skill did not diminish. If anything, each year of combat honed him further, each battle adding another layer of experience to his martial prowess. Where youth might have granted speed and strength, age gave him an economy of violence that was terrible to behold. No movement wasted, no strike without purpose. He killed with the dispassionate efficiency of a master craftsman practicing his art. The centuries of crusade became a millennium, and still Sigismund fought on. His body began to show the signs of extreme age that even the estate's physiology cannot indefinitely foretold. His movements, once fluid as quicks, became slightly stiffer. The recovery time between engagements lengthened. Wounds that once would have healed in days now took weeks. The physical decline was imperceptible to most. But I, who had observed him for 1,000 years, could see the change, as could he. Perhaps that was why, when word reached the Eternal Crusader of a massive chaos incursion near the Eye of Terror, Sigismund ordered an immediate course change. The First Black Crusade, as it would later be known, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, heir to the treachery of Horus. Intelligence reports indicated a force of unprecedented size and ferocity, traitor Est Artis, who had spent the millennium since the heresy in the time-warping embrace of the Eye, emerging now to carry on the war their fallen war master had begun. The journey to the Gothic sector was made in contemplative silence. Sigismund spent most of it in the ship's chapel, kneeling before the altar with his ancient blade laid before him. The weapon, like its wielder, bore the marks of innumerable battles. Its edge was still keen, but the metal of the blade was worn, reforged countless times over the centuries. I observed him from the shadows, my augmented senses detecting subtle changes in his physiological state. His heartbeat, normally as steady as a metronome, occasionally faltered. His breathing usually measured and controlled, sometimes caught. Small signs invisible to most, but telling to one who had catalogued his every aspect for a millennium. Sigismund knew he was facing his final battle, and he embraced it with the same cold certainty that had characterized his entire life since donning the black armor of the Emperor's champion. During this journey, he composed what would later become known as the Last Testament of Sigismund, a document that would be preserved in the archives of the Black Templars and studied by generations of warriors yet unborn. It was not a tactical treatise or a strategic assessment of the coming conflict. It was a theological reflection, a distillation of the faith he had forged over a millennium of warfare. In it, he spoke not of victories or defeats, not of specific campaigns or foes, but of the nature of the war the Black Templars waged and would continue to wage long after he was gone. The struggle is eternal, P wrote in a hand that had become spidery with age, but lost none of its precision. It does not end with the death of any single enemy, with the liberation of any single world, with the passing of any single warrior. It continues across time and space, a constant that defines human existence in this hostile universe. We fight not for peace is a lie that would leave us vulnerable to the predations of the warp and the Xenos. We fight not for victory, for final victory would mean the end of purpose, the end of meaning. We fight because it is our nature, because it is our duty, because it is the only possible response to the darkness that surrounds us. In the crucible of battle, we find the purest expression of the Emperor's will, the clearest manifestation of his divine purpose for mankind, to be his sword, his shield, his fire in the night. When we arrived at the Choron system, the devastation was already extensive. Several worlds burned, their surfaces churned by orbital bombardment and ground assault alike. The remnants of Imperial fleet assets had been pushed back to the edge of the system, maintaining a desperate cordon that the Chaos forces probed and tested, but had not yet broken. At the heart of the enemy armada was a vessel of immense proportions, a desecrated battle barge that intelligence identified as the Vengeful Spirit, the very ship aboard which the Emperor had nearly been slain. The flagship of Horus, now claimed by his successor, Abaddon. The name of that vessel carried weight beyond its strategic significance. It was a symbol of the greatest betrayal in human history, of the moment when the Imperium had nearly been destroyed from within. For Sigismund, who had fought through the Siege of Terror, but never faced Horus directly, the Vengeful Spirit represented the ultimate challenge, the physical manifestation of all he had sworn to oppose. Its presence in real space leading another assault on the Imperium was both a desecration and an opportunity. A chance to confront not just Abaddon, but the legacy of Horus himself. Sigismund ordered the Eternal Crusader to punch directly through the enemy formation, aiming for the dark heart of the Chaos fleet. It was a tactic that would have been deemed suicidal by most Void strategists, but the ancient battle barge was built for such audacity. Its reinforced prow split traitor vessels like a blade through flesh, its weapon batteries clearing a path through the smaller ships that attempted to swarm it. The damage we sustained was severe, but Sigismund cared nothing for the state of the vessel. His focus was singular, to reach Abaddon, to face the heir of Horus as he had never had the chance to face the War Master himself. The Void battle was a symphony of destruction, a dance of warships through the darkness between worlds. each maneuver calculated to bring maximum firepower to bear while minimizing exposure to enemy weapons. The Eternal Crusader was not a subtle instrument. It was a hammer wielded with terrible purpose, driving straight for its target regardless of the cost. Ships burned in our wake, both enemy and ally. As the single-minded determination of Sigismund was translated into void tactics of stunning simplicity and devastating effectiveness, we broke through to the relative calm at the center of the chaos formation. Finding ourselves in weapons range of the vengeful spirit itself, the traitor flagship turned its massive guns upon us, but Sigismund had already moved to the teleportarium chamber. A strike force had been assembled, 100 of the most veteran Black Templars, each one a warrior who had fought in dozens of campaigns. They would teleport aboard the enemy vessel, fight their way to Abaddon, and end the Black Crusade by removing its head. The selection of this strike force had not been left to chance or mere seniority. Sigismund had personally chosen each warrior, not based solely on combat prowess or tactical acumen, but on a quality harder to define, but instantly recognizable to one who embodied it so completely. Faith, not the shallow piety of ritual observance, but the bone-deep certainty that transcended reason and emotion alike. These were warriors who, like their high marshal, had transformed themselves from men into weapons, who had surrendered individual identity in favor of becoming instruments of the Emperor's will. Before he stepped onto the teleport pad, Sigismund turned to me. It was a rare acknowledgement of my presence. For centuries he had allowed me to observe and record without comment, as if I were merely another fixture of the ship rather than a conscious entity. But now he fixed me with eyes that had seen a millennium of war and spoke words I have preserved with perfect recall. "Record it all, chronicler," he said, his voice a rough whisper that nonetheless carried the authority of ages. "Let those who come after know that faith endures when flesh fails. That duty outlasts death, that the Emperor protects even when we fall." Then he was gone in a flash of teleport energy, and I was left to monitor the battle through the ship's auger arrays and the sporadic Vox transmissions from the boarding party. The fighting was intense. The Black Templars carving a path of destruction through the corrupted corridors of the vengeful spirit. But the defenders were not merely traitor Astartes. They were the bringers of despair. Abdon's chosen terminators, warriors who had fought alongside Horus himself during the heresy, and they exacted a terrible toll on the boarding party. The Vox transmissions from the strike force painted a picture of nightmarish combat. The interior of the vengeful spirit had been transformed by its time in the Eye of Terror. Its corridors no longer conforming to the rational architecture of imperial design, but twisting according to the whims of the ruinous powers. Gravity shifted without warning. Walls became floors and ceilings opened into abysses that led to nowhere and everywhere at once. The very air was toxic, carrying whispers that induced madness in the unwary. Promises of power that tested the faith of even the most devoted. Through this hellscape, the Black Templars fought with the single-minded determination that was their hallmark. Each step forward was purchased with blood. Each junction secured at the cost of brothers who fell to wounds that defied the laws of physics and biology alike. But always they pressed on, driven by the implacable will of Sigismund, who led from the front, his ancient blade carving a path through flesh and reality toward the heart of the vessel where their quarry awaited. Of the 100 who teleported aboard, barely a dozen reached the command deck where Abaddon awaited, and at their head was Sigismund, his ancient armor bearing fresh damage, his movements slowed by wounds sustained in the fighting, but his purpose undiminished. The Vox feed from his armor showed Abaddon rising from a throne fashioned from the melted weapons of fallen loyalists. A massive figure in Terminator plate adorned with trophies of 10,000 atrocities. In his hand was Dracnian, a sword that was more than a weapon, a blade that contained a bound daemon of incredible power. Abaddon was not, as Sigismund remembered him. The first captain of the Lunar Wolves had been a formidable warrior, to be sure, but still recognizably human in his proportions and demeanor. The being that rose to face them now was something more and less. His armor had melded with his flesh, the boundaries between the two blurred by the warping influence of the warp. His face was a mask of scars, his scalp bare, saved for the top knot that had been his signature even before the heresy. But it was his eyes that revealed the greatest change. Where once they had held ambition, pride, even a certain rough honor, now they burned with a hatred so pure it transcended mere emotion, becoming a force as palpable as gravity. Lapdog comes to heel. Abdon's voice was distorted by his helmet vox, but the contempt in it was unmistakable. "Do you know how long I have waited for this moment, Sigismund? To face the so-called greatest blade in the Imperium to prove that devotion to corpse gods breeds only weakness." Sigismund did not respond with words. He attacked. What followed was a duel that would be remembered for millennia, though few accurate accounts of it exist beyond my own recording. Two champions, each representing opposed ideologies, each the product of 10 centuries of war and hate. Abdon had youth and the dark gifts of the chaos gods on his side. Sigismund had experience and a lifetime of devotion to his cause. They were evenly matched, their blades moving with such speed that even the augmented senses of the Astartes present could barely follow the exchange of blows. The remaining Black Templars formed a perimeter around the dueling champions, holding back the bringers of despair who sought to intervene. It was a battle within a battle, the outcome of each tied inextricably to the other. If Sigismund fell, the strike force would be overwhelmed. If the perimeter broke, Abaddon would have reinforcements that would tip the balance of the duel. Both commanders knew this. Both fought with the knowledge that their personal contest was merely one facet of a larger conflict that spanned the ship, the system, and ultimately the galaxy itself. For 17 minutes by the chronometric count, they fought without clear advantage to either side. Sigismund's blade found Abdon's armor repeatedly, scoring the Terminator plate with cuts that would have crippled a lesser opponent. Drain, in turn, came within millimeters of ending the High Marshal multiple times. Only his preternatural reflexes, allowing him to avoid or parry blows that carried not just physical force, but spiritual corruption. The deck around them became slick with blood, both red and black, the footing treacherous, the air thick with the scent of burned metal, and the ozone tang of power weapons at full charge. But time and wounds told Sigismund, already bleeding from injuries sustained in the approach, began to slow. His parries came a fraction of a second too late. His counters lacked the killing power needed to penetrate Abdon's Terminator plate. And eventually the inevitable occurred. Dracnian found a gap in Sigismund's guard, the daemon sword punching through his armor and into his primary heart. The Black Templar staggered, but did not fall. Instead, with the last of his strength, he drove his own blade into Abaddon's chest. Not a killing blow, but a wounding one, piercing the War Master's air just as he himself had been pierced. For a moment, they stood locked together. Two enemies transfixed upon each other's blades, neither willing to be the first to fall. Abaddon spoke again, his voice now a wet growl as blood filled his throat. "You have lost, old man. Your Imperium crumbles. Your emperor is a rotting corpse on a throne of lies. What was it all for? 1,000 years of crusade. And what has it gained you?" Sigismund's response, captured by his armor's vox and transmitted to the Eternal Crusader, was clear. "Despite the damage to his systems, you still do not understand, even after all this time. It was never about victory." "Then what?" Abaddon demanded, twisting his blade deeper into Sigismund's chest. "Defiance," the High Marshal whispered. And with his last breath, he spat blood into the face of his killer. Abdon roared in frustration and tore his blade free, letting Sigismund's body fall to the deck. The remaining Black Templars fought to recover their fallen lord, several sacrificing themselves to secure his corpse and the ancient sword he wielded. Through desperate heroics and at terrible cost, they managed to return to the teleportarium and transmit back to the Eternal Crusader, bringing with them the mortal remains of the Emperor's champion. We fled the battle then, the ship grievously damaged, many of its systems failing. But the navigators plotted a course that would take us clear of the worst of the fighting, and we limped away from the Corin system as the First Black Crusade continued to ravage the sector. Abaddon would eventually withdraw his forces back to the Eye of Terror, but not before inflicting horrific casualties and claiming numerous worlds for the ruinous powers. By most strategic assessments, the First Black Crusade was a victory for chaos. The return journey was a somber procession. Sigismund's body was prepared according to the rites he himself had established. His armor carefully removed and repaired. His wounds cleaned and dressed as if he were merely sleeping rather than dead. The chapter's apothecaries extracted his gene seed with reverential care, ensuring that the genetic legacy of the Emperor's champion would continue in future generations of Black Templars. His weapons were cleaned and blessed, the ancient sword placed in a stasis field to preserve it until his successor could be chosen. Throughout the ship, brothers maintained a vigil, each warrior taking a turn to stand guard over the fallen High Marshal to bear witness to his sacrifice to honor the example he had set for them all. Prayers were offered continuously, the battle chapels filled at all hours with black-armored figures reciting the liturgies Sigismund had composed, finding in ritual a structure to contain their grief and rage. There was no wailing, no display of emotion that might be deemed unseemly for warriors of their caliber. But in the rigid formality of their mourning, in the precision with which they performed the prescribed rites, there was a depth of feeling that transcended mere displays of grief. Yet in the centuries that followed, the legend of Sigismund's last stand would inspire countless imperial warriors. The wound he inflicted on Abdon would trouble the despoiler for years. A lingering reminder that even in defeat, the servants of the emperor could extract a price. And the Black Templars, far from being diminished by the loss of their founder, were galvanized. The second High Marshal, Sigismund's chosen successor, would lead the chapter to even greater crusades, their numbers swelling as more and more warriors were drawn to the legacy of the emperor's champion. The succession had been determined long before the final battle. Sigismund, ever the strategist, despite his increasing religious fervor, had designated Bohemond as his heir apparent, grooming the younger warrior to assume leadership when the time came. Bohemond had absorbed not just the tactical doctrines and organizational principles that guided the Black Templars, but the spiritual philosophy that gave those practical matters their meaning. He was not Sigismund, could never replicate the unique combination of martial prowess and religious vision that had defined the first High Marshal. But he was a worthy successor, one who understood that his role was not to replace Sigismund, but to continue his work, to maintain the momentum of a crusade that had been set in motion by a will stronger than his own. I remained aboard the Eternal Crusader, my function unchanged despite the passing of the one whose deeds I had primarily recorded. High Marshals came and went, each adding to the chapter's glory, each honoring the traditions Sigismund had established. And I observed them all, comparing each to the standard set by the first, finding all of them worthy warriors, but none who quite captured the terrible purpose that had driven Sigismund. In the centuries that followed, the story of Sigismund's duel with Abdon would be told and retold, embellished with each telling until it achieved the status of sacred myth. In some versions, Sigismund defeated a dozen Chaos champions before facing the despoiler. In others, he wounded Abdon so grievously that the traitor had to be dragged back to the Eye of Terror, clinging to life. The truth, as always, was both more mundane and more profound. One warrior passed his prime, but unyielding in his faith, facing an opponent who should have overwhelmed him with ease, managing through skill and devotion to wound his enemy even as he fell. A small victory and a larger defeat, but a victory nonetheless. The sword of the High Marshals was recovered and passed to Sigismund's successor, though none would wield it with quite the same deadly grace as its first master. His armor, too badly damaged to be repaired, was preserved in the reclusium of the Eternal Crusader, a relic of the chapter's founding that would inspire generations of Black Templars yet unborn. And his body, after the proper rites had been observed, was committed to the void, as tradition demanded. The Emperor's champion returned to the stars from which all men are ultimately born. But the crusade he began never ended. The Black Templars continued their eternal war, spreading across the galaxy in crusade fleets that brought the Emperor's justice to countless worlds. Their faith, first kindled by Sigismund during the darkest days of the Horus heresy, burned ever brighter with each passing century. While other chapters faltered or fell, while the Imperium itself endured challenges that threatened to tear it apart, the sons of Sigismund remained true to their purpose. War without end, devotion without limit, faith without doubt. Now, millennia after his death, I still serve aboard this ancient vessel, my mechanical systems maintained by generations of tech marines who know nothing of the man I once was. I am as much a relic as the artifacts in the ship's reclusium, a living record of a time that has passed into legend. Of all who now serve aboard the Eternal Crusader, only I remember Sigismund as he truly was. Not the saint that chapter legend has made him, but the man, the warrior who transformed himself into a weapon through the force of his own will, who forged his faith into a blade sharper than any steel. The Black Templars have changed over the millennia, as all things must. Their rituals have evolved, their beliefs shaped by the experiences of countless crusades across the breadth of the Imperium and beyond. But at their core, they remain as Sigismund made them. Warriors who find purpose in faith, who seek battle not as an end in itself, but as a form of devotion, who believe with unshakable conviction that the universe is not a place of random chance and meaningless suffering, but a crucible in which mankind's soul is tested and purified through hardship. When new initiates join the chapter, part of their indoctrination involves hearing the tale of Sigismund's final battle. They learn of how the first High Marshal, ancient even by the standards of the Est Artis, faced the heir of Horus and wounded him even as he fell. They are taught that this is the epitome of what it means to be a Black Templar. Not to seek victory at all costs, but to remain defiant until the end. To recognize that in a galaxy of such vastness where the enemies of mankind are beyond counting, strategic victory may be impossible. But moral victory, the triumph of the human spirit over despair and corruption, is always within reach. This lesson is imparted not just through words, but through ritual reenactment. The initiates are taken to a chamber deep within the ship where holothic projectors recreate the duel between Sigismund and Abaddon. They witness the exchange of blows, the wounds sustained by both combatants, the final exchange that left the High Marshal dead but unbowed. The simulation is adjusted to account for the embellishments that have anchored to the tale over the centuries, presenting a version that is more myth than history, more symbol than fact. But the core truth remains the same. In his final moments, Sigismund embodied the ideal to which all Black Templars aspire. Absolute devotion expressed through defiance in the face of inevitable defeat. I have seen countless Black Templars live and die by this creed. I have recorded their deeds, preserved their names in the chapter's archives, watched as they strove to live up to the example set by their founder. Some achieved great glory. Others met ignominious ends on nameless worlds. But all in their own way carried forward the legacy of Sigismund. The belief that faith can transcend death, that duty can outlast defeat, that purpose can transform a mere warrior into something approaching the divine. In my archives, I still have the recording of Sigismund's final words to Abaddon. That simple, defiant statement that encapsulated everything he stood for. Not victory, but defiance. Not the triumph of arms, but the unyielding human spirit that refuses to bow even in the face of overwhelming odds. It is this spirit that animates the Black Templars to this day, that drives them to continue their endless crusade across a galaxy that grows ever darker, ever more hostile to the light of human civilization. And I wonder sometimes in the quiet moments between battles as the eternal crusader cuts through the void toward yet another war whether Sigismund found what he was seeking in that final confrontation. Not victory. He was too pragmatic a warrior even in his zealotry to believe he could defeat the champion of chaos in his own stronghold. But perhaps a kind of completion. The closing of a circle that began when he first donned the black armor of the Emperor's champion and set himself apart from his brothers. Sigismund's life was one of transformation. From exemplary warrior to living symbol, from dutiful son to zealous crusader, from man to myth. Each step of that journey was a conscious choice, a deliberate sacrifice of some portion of his humanity in service to a greater purpose. By the end, there was little left of the man who had once stood at Rogel Dawn's right hand. Only the weapon remained, honed to its final keenness, ready for the hand of destiny to wield it one last time. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Sigismund. Not just the chapter he founded, not just the crusade he began, but the example he set of absolute dedication to a cause. In an age where certainty has become the rarest of commodities, where the Imperium is besieged on all sides by enemies without and corruption within, such single-minded purpose is both inspiring and terrible to behold. It offers a kind of clarity that few in this Bennett millennium can achieve. A life without doubt, without hesitation, without regret. The Eternal Crusader continues its endless journey through the stars, carrying the sons of Sigismund to war after war. And I remain watching, recording, preserving the memory of a warrior who became legend, who showed that faith could be forged into a weapon as deadly as any blade, who proved that even in defeat, defiance could sow the seeds of future victory. In a galaxy where darkness presses in from all sides, where the enemies of mankind multiply beyond counting, where the Emperor himself is bound to a slowly failing golden throne, such defiance may be all that stands between humanity and extinction. The stubborn refusal to yield, to compromise, to accept defeat, the willingness to fight on when all hope seems lost, when victory is impossible, when death is certain. Not for glory, not for reward, but because it is right, because it is necessary, because it is the only choice a true servant of the Emperor can make. Sigismund understood this truth a millennium before the rest of the Imperium grasped it. He saw with a clarity born of absolute faith that mankind's future would not be one of progress or enlightenment, but of endurance, of holding fast against the encroaching night, of fighting not to advance, but merely to survive. And in that understanding, he transformed himself into the perfect warrior for such an age. Unyielding, uncompromising, unbowed. The Black Templars honor his memory not just with words or rituals but with deeds. Each crusade they undertake, each battle they fight, each victory they win, and each defeat they endure all form part of the living monument to their founder. The Emperor's champion may have fallen, but his spirit lives on in every warrior who dons the black armor and takes up the sword in his name, who fights without hope of final victory, but with the certainty that the fight itself is what matters. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, such certainty may be the greatest gift one can possess. And it was Sigismund's final gift to the Imperium he served for 1,000 years. The knowledge that even in the face of inevitable defeat, defiance remains a victory of its own kind, a triumph of the human spirit over despair, of faith over doubt, of duty over death itself. I, Chronicler Unit 379112, record this testament so that the truth may endure alongside the legend. So that those who come after may know not just the mythic figure that chapter tradition has created, but the man who chose to become a weapon in service to his God, who forged his faith into a blade that would outlast his mortal form, who showed that in an age of darkness, it is not hope that sustains us, but purpose. Not optimism, but resolve, not the promise of victory, but the refusal to acknowledge defeat. Sigismund, the Emperor's champion, the Black Knight of Dawn, the first High Marshal, a warrior who lived without fear and died without regret, whose legacy endures in the chapter he founded and the crusade that bears his name, who proved with his final defiant breath that faith can transcend death itself. The stars grow cold. The galaxy burns. The enemies of mankind gather for the final assault on all that remains of the Emperor's vision. And still the Black Templars fight on, bearing the standard first raised by Sigismund 100 centuries ago. Still they hold to the creed he established in those dark days after the Siege of Terror. Still they find purpose in devotion, strength in faith, victory in defiance. For that is the final truth. Sigismund understood. In a war without end against enemies beyond counting, it is not the outcome of any single battle that matters. It is the willingness to fight at all, to stand unbowed before the darkness, to proclaim with blade and bolter and blood that humanity will not go quietly into the endless night, but will rage against it until the last star falls. Sigismund is gone, but the blade he forged in the crucible of his faith will never.